Hey everyone, time for another wander. We're going to take a walk today along the river trail, which is our most popular trail on campus. We own about 2 miles of riverfront along Swannanoa River, and we have a trail that goes down it both east over by the sawmill and by the farm, and west out this way. Again, I just want to let everybody know these trails are still closed, but we'll take a walk along it and point out some of the things we see that you would see when you get back on the trail. So one of the first things I wanted to point out while we're walking is river cane. Here's a bunch of river cane right here. This is Arundinaria gigantea. This is actually a bamboo. A lot of people ask me about this when they walk along the river. This is a bamboo species. It's a native bamboo species to the United States. And bamboo is actually a grass. It's a big grass. This is called river cane. Some of you have heard about cane brakes. Years ago, before this land was turned into agricultural land, this habitat here would cover most of the floodplain, would be river cane, up until it started rising up into the hills, would all be river cane, and they were called cane brakes. These are really important for wildlife at the time. There were a couple warbler species that really used it, and also the bison that was in this area, the bison that inhabited this area would use these cane brakes for cover. It's a really important species for the Native Americans in this area. It was used for arrow shafts, double weave baskets were made out of it, mats, religious mats for ceremonial mats were weaved out of it. Right now it's only remnant populations that we have up and down the Swannanoa River. We have a couple great populations here. Last fall, during the mitigation process, we actually were able to give away a bunch of river cane that's been used throughout the area to reestablish cane brakes along some of the rivers. So this is river cane, Arundinaria gigantea. Great species, a grass species. I would never want to have to mow it with a lawnmower. It gets to 15, 20 feet tall. Let's walk down the river a piece. As you're walking on the river trail, you'll notice some of these metal tags on some of these trees. This is some research that's being done by Lisa Hovey and Amy Boyd, 2 of our botany professors and plant ecology professors at campus, and it's a phenology experiment. Phenology is a study that looks at the timing of natural history events in an animal or a plant's life history. And for trees, it's kind of like, when does it flower? When does it produce leaves? When do the leaves drop? And so right now we've started a large study on campus looking at the phenology of trees along this river. And we need this data as a way to understand how things are going to change with climate change. Are species' natural history traits, are their flowering traits, fruiting traits, leafing traits, going to shift due to climate change and changes in temperature? This is going to be really important to understand, because down the road we could run into something called asynchrony. In other words, if we have migratory birds, for example, that come back to this area and have evolved to come back at the same time that their forage, their food species are ready, berries, flowers, whatever it is, if they come back, and with climate change, if those berries have been produced or those food have been produced 2 weeks before they got back now, and we have a shift, they get back and all of a sudden they don't have the food source they needed. This is going to play a big role in pollinators also down the road. So we're really trying to understand, how are these life history timings and changes shifting with climate change? It's kind of interesting, but what do you think might be one of the best data sources for phenology out there? Think about it. Long-term studies that track when certain species flower or fruit or leaf out. It's kind of interesting, but Old English gardeners kept amazing diaries of their gardens and when things happened in their gardens. So a lot of data, a lot of great data goes back to those old English gardens from 100 years ago. This species here, sorry Pete, I made Pete slow down too quick. This is a black cherry. We saw black cherry a while ago in one of our first rambles, one of our first wanders. But this one here is more adult. It has this very distinctive dark bark with these plates. And a lot of people describe the bark as looking like burnt potato chips glued to the tree. Bark is one of the most difficult ID features for trees. It takes a while to get a good eye for bark, but this is black cherry. Here's something we all know and love. I don't know if you can focus in on this, Pete, but these are red maple samaras, what we call helicopters. Here's one here. This is actually, the true name for these is samara, not helicopters, although helicopters are the fun thing we used to call them as kids. But these are, samaras are any winged seed, any seed that has this winged appendage that's used for short distance travel. So in other words, short distance travel for a seed is they fall from the tree and they're always falling down, but they have an outward trajectory. Unlike things like willow that have long distance travel, that get up into the air and can travel for miles. So these are red maple samaras. Here's another great species. This is spicebush. This is another species that you find growing along these floodplains and riverbanks. You don't really find it in an upland site. It's more an indicator of wet sites or very rich soil sites. But this one is a great species for wildlife. It has a berry that's due in the fall, and those berries are full of fats and lipids, so they're high energy for those species. You'll always know spicebush. It's a real easy one to tell. It has these smallish leaves. It's never a tree. It's always a shrub, usually with multi-stems. But if you scratch it, if you just scratch some of the newer bark and you smell it, my mother used to dust her furniture with lemon fresh pledge. And that's exactly what this smells like. It smells lemony, like that pledge, that spray that people used to use. Maybe people still do use it, I don't know. I don't dust with pledge. But that's spicebush. You know, when you think about these berry producing shrubs and you think about wildlife, one of the things that's really important to consider if you own your own land and you want to have birds, you want to have wildlife on your land, is making sure you have the full suite of species for forage, right? Forage meaning food. And so while this is a great fall forage for migratory birds getting ready to fly home, you also want to have spring forage for animals when they fly back, especially neotropical migratory birds. And so something like Amelanchier or serviceberry is a great one to have because that's a spring fruiting species. And then of course you also want to have summer species here. Things like blackberries are a great one, blueberries are a great one for summer. You want to have things like spicebush for the fall and dogwood for the fall, but then you also want to have species that have wildlife value, forage value in the winter. Things like the berries off of cedar, sumac seeds, and those types of species. So understanding, again, getting back to this idea of phenology, understanding when certain species produce their fruit is really important for wildlife management. This here is a beautiful tree. This is actually one of my favorite trees on campus here. This is a big black walnut. Juglans nigra. This is a big black walnut tree. It's got great form. I talked a while back in one of our other rambles about white pine being a valuable timber tree. White pine is a valuable timber tree in a different way. It's a very valuable tree. Volume, we grow a lot of white pine. So by volume, it's very important. This one here by board foot, and a board foot is how timber is sold. A board foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch. And this one's very valuable by unit. In other words, it's far more valuable by unit, by board foot, than white pine, but we don't get the same volume. And this is used for furniture, flooring, that type of thing. And then over here, we have another floodplain tree that's growing here. This is buckeye. This is our buckeye. Here's the buckeye leaves. The traditional buckeye leaves, this compound with the 5 leaflets. Buckeye grows along floodplains in this area. It also grows at higher elevations in really rich soils, rich cove forests. And the buckeye nut, I don't think we have any buckeye nuts here right now, but some of you might have seen the buckeye nut. It's about the size of a golf ball. It's brown. It's got a white spot on one side of it. The old timers in this area say that buckeye was a great, the buckeye nut was a great way to cure arthritis. And what they would do is keep one in their pocket and they would just roll it around between their fingers to cure arthritis. And more likely it was just the fact that they kept their fingers moving that kept them limber. Here's a vine species. We got a lot going on today. Here's a vine species. This is grapevine. This is our grapevine, our native grapevine, going up into the trees. You could tell grapevine, and I'll show you a couple other vines down the road. You could tell grapevine because it's this reddish cinnamony color, but it's got this really shreddy bark. It's got this really shreddy bark that comes off in these red strips. So this is our native grape. Could be fox grape, muscadine grape. I'd have to get up into the tree and key it out to figure out which one it is. There's some nice vines. Those are old. Those are some old vines right there. Old grapevines. This here is a sycamore tree. This is an American sycamore tree. This one is a tree you really do find along floodplains, okay? These areas, and what I mean by floodplains are these areas along our rivers that don't immediately go up into upland. They have these large flat plains along the side of them. Right now, all of those floodplains are the Warren Wilson farm. Before the farmland, why they're so rich is because when these areas would flood, the water would come up and deposit sediment onto these floodplains, and they make for really rich soil. So sycamore has a really interesting bark pattern. It's dark down here at the bottom, but when you look up at the top, it's very mottled. When I was a kid growing up, we had a big sycamore tree back when people still terrorized the neighborhood on bicycles and you had a bunch of 10-year-olds riding around. And what we would do is always say we're going to meet by the army tree because the top of the sycamore looks like fatigues, like army fatigues. Sycamore has an interesting life history trait in that it can grow on these floodplains because if you think about it, these soils are basically particles of sand, particles of rock, small particles with air between them. But in these floodplains, when they fill up with water, they're oxygen poor, right? And a lot of trees can't live in those environments. Sycamore is able to live in soils that are oxygen poor due to flooding. Now, many of you might think about back home, and the sycamore makes a great street tree. A lot of street trees, a lot of street plantings are sycamore. And that makes sense because the compacted soils of urban environments, without the oxygen between the particles, the compacted soils of urban environments are similar to the flooded environments here on floodplains. So trees that do well on floodplains also do really well in compacted soils in urban environments. So that's sycamore. Sycamore is a beautiful wood, really pretty. You can get some streaks of pink, some streaks of yellow in the wood. The problem with sycamore is the grains on it and the fibers on it are such that due to humidity, every day based on the humidity level in the atmosphere, the board will twist and turn. So it's really difficult to work with. The seeds from a sycamore are in these balls. You might notice these balls hanging from the trees. Again, maybe if I hold it in front of my shirt. These balls. What these are isn't a single fruit. This is called an inflorescence. It's a ball of flowers that form many, many seeds, and they break up. right? And each one of these is called an achene, each one of these seeds. This is a really interesting seed in that, first off, they disperse a long way by wind, right? They're feathery and they disperse by wind, but they also float on water. So they're dispersed by wind and by water. So these will ride on the top of the water until they hit the bank, and they'll stick in the mud, and then they'll grow up. So that's American sycamore. Here's a little patch of spring beauties. This is a pretty plant. These are spring beauties right here with these pink flowers, these small pink flowers. These are one of our first plants to flower in the spring, all along these rich riverbanks. And I don't know if I can get one, but they grow. That's not a very good example. They grow in tubers. They grow in tubers. I did not get the tuber. I got a piece of grass. I'll find a bigger tuber later on. But they grow in these tubers that are kind of like potatoes. Here's one. Might get one here. I'm a highly trained professional. I know how to do this without ruining the plants. Please don't dig up our plants on the river trail. But what they get are these small tubers. This is a little one. I don't even know if you can see it, but this round tuber right here. Very starchy, and the Native Americans in this region would eat them like potatoes, like a starch crop. So that's spring beauty. Pretty plant with these strappy leaves, long strappy leaves, 5 petals. Spring beauty. Anybody guess what this is? This is a dead tree. Actually, it's a snag, right? This is what we call a snag, a dead standing tree. Again, you know, I talk a lot about values. What are the values of different species in a forest? And we got to make sure we don't just think about economic value. These snags have great wildlife value, okay? Great ecosystem and wildlife value. These dead standing trees are important for birds. Insects get in them, decomposers get in them. You get birds, gleaning birds like creepers and woodpeckers that pull out the insects. These along rivers, because they don't have fine branches, they make great perches for predatory birds, hawks, those types of birds. They also store carbon longer standing than they would on the ground. They would decompose quicker if they were on the ground than if they're standing. So these standing dead trees are really important for ecosystems. And in fact, when we're writing management plans for different forests, we try to assess how many snags there are in the forest, and if there's not enough per acre, we can actually create them by girdling, taking a hatchet and girdling all the way around it to cut off the sugars and the waters from flowing and kill the tree standing. So this is a snag, a dead standing tree. So does anybody know where the water from the Swannanoa River ultimately ends up? I'll give you a second. Where does the water from the Swannanoa River, this water that's passing us right now, where does it ultimately end up? It ultimately ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So it flows it's the Swannanoa River, starts up Black Mountain Way. Swannanoa River comes down, goes into the French Broad River, which is a very ancient river. The French Broad heads into the Tennessee River. The Tennessee River then hits the Ohio River. The Ohio hits the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the course that this water follows. We have a few other tributaries to the Swannanoa River on campus, the main one being Bull Creek, which heads into it, which is in another compartment of our forest up top. We use the heck out of this river for classes. Mark Brenner, our aquatic ecologist, does a lot of aquatic ecology classes using this. Pat Scioto is another. He's our fish ecologist, our ichthyologist. He does a lot of fish courses in this river. We actually have a couple other great projects going on in this river. We've just worked with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission to do some mussel reintroduction into the river. Mussels are really taking a hit up and down these rivers due to mostly siltation and warmer water temperatures. And so the Wildlife Commission has been breeding out mussels, and the students have run projects where we've reintroduced them to the river. We're also doing a great study with the University of Indiana assessing bat populations along this river. Students have had the opportunity to monitor sonar stations for bats, and also to do mist netting in the evenings to catch bats and tag them and identify the species of bats that inhabit this river. So again, you know, if you're thinking of coming to Warren Wilson College and you want to do a lot of field studies, we have not only the forested upland terrestrial habitats for study, but we also have these great riparian and aquatic habitats for study, and we use them. What you're seeing behind me is the Warren Wilson classroom for environmental studies. Oh, here's another good species. It's too bad we're going to have to wrap this one up in a couple minutes. This one here is Solomon seal. This is Solomon seal here. Has these flowers that hang down underneath. It's a type of lily, actually. It's a species in the broad lily family. This is a species that's being used now. The rhizome of this species has some compounds that are being used in hand creams and face creams. It's good for your skin. It also has a starchy tuber, much the same as I talked about with the spring beauty. That is also thought of as a starch crop. Now, some of you might say, hey, what's the difference between false Solomon seal and true Solomon seal? And that's a great question. They're somewhat related. They're not in the same genus, but the false Solomon seal will have a plume of white flowers coming from the tip. If any of you have seen that, a plume of white flowers coming from the tip. In one of our wanders, we might see that. Whereas the true Solomon seal has the flowers coming down, drooping down at each leaf axil from underneath. So that's the Solomon seal plant. Really pretty plant. This is a plant that we propagate right now by seed and put back out into the forest. Any of you remember what this is from our past ramble? Come on now, I know you do. This is mayapple. On one of our past wanders, I talked about how important it was to know if you're going to work in dendrology, the study of trees, if you're going to work in botany, to understand Latin names and what they mean. Again, in my classes, it's not about remembering dates. It's about concepts. It's about systems. It's about thinking about how ecological systems work together and how they can be managed. But I do make my students learn the Latin names of their trees and plants. And this is a great example. This is Carpinus caroliniana. This is musselwood. And if you can see, one of the traits of musselwood is the tree itself, the stem of the tree looks like a tightened muscle, like a sinewy muscle, right? It's not round. If you were to cut this right here and look down on it, it'd be fluted around the edge, right? It's a really dense wood, really hard, really slow growing, dense wood. But the name musselwood, it's also called ironwood. It's also called Eastern hop hornbeam, American hornbeam. Not in this area, but in other areas. But we have another tree called Ostraya that is also called ironwood by some people. It's not so often called musselwood, but it's also called by the hop hornbeams. So this is Carpinus caroliniana, musselwood. On one of our next rambles, I will show you Ostraya. So remember your Latin. Your Latin's very important if you're going to do dendrology. We'll look at another vine. If you look at this vine here, remember the grapevine was reddish, and the grapevine was reddish, and it was also very strippy. If you look at this, it's kind of grayish. This bark right here on this vine is grayish. And you might notice these small horizontal lines in here. This is Oriental Bittersweet. It's another vine that entwines. It goes up. The grape you saw over there will hold on by tendrils. This one will entwine. But it's a little bit different looking and it's lighter colored. And it's got these what are called lenticels on it. Think of lenticels as little pores in the bark. And lenticels actually are able to exchange gas in and out of the tree. Not just on the leaves, not just the stomates on the leaves, but trees that have lentils are able to exchange gas with the outside world through their bark. So this is Oriental Bittersweet. Oriental Bittersweet, you know, we've talked a little bit about invasives. If I think of all the invasive species that inhabit this forest here, Oriental Bittersweet is one of the ones that I think can cause the most problems. It can really take out the canopies of trees. It can take over a site. One of the interesting things about Oriental Bittersweet is the Biltmore Estate, which is right next to us. I've done natural history and history tours there, and their historian has tongue-in-cheek said that he thinks that the Biltmore Estate is the loci for bringing Oriental Bittersweet into the country, because they think that they brought it in there for planting years ago, and it has spread from there. It's also spread by seeds, by birds. So this one can cause some problems. And again, I want to be careful. I think we need to rethink our invasive species, how we treat them, how we think about them. I don't think it's okay to let them grow wherever they are. I'm not saying that. But there are certain situations where the site and what we're trying to do at the site is more important than the different species we're looking at. So this is Oriental Bittersweet. I think that's going to be it for today. We're going to do another one of these soon, maybe a little more management focus. So I want to thank you all for listening. Again, if you have any suggestions for future wanders, send me an email, send it to our Facebook page, and we can get out into some of the habitats you're interested in. Take care, everybody.